Hey guys, tonight we will journey back to the scorching desert of ancient Mesopotamia, where Marcus Lucinius Cassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, built his empire on the suffering of others, only to discover that greed, when taken too far, becomes its own executioner. This is not just a story about a horrific death, but also a bitter lesson on the true nature of power. This story is compiled from various sources, so I really hope you watch to the end to help distinguish fact from fiction, because we are a community that loves history. If you find any details that are correct or incorrect, please leave a comment below so everyone can discuss together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you live and what your local time is in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, beginning with a languid sunset over the dunes. Let us close our eyes and envision the scene in the parched desert of ancient Mesopotamia in 53 BCE. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, began his life with an insatiable thirst for power and glory. To understand this man more deeply, we must first review his background. Marcus Licinius Crassus was born around 115 BCE into a distinguished patrician family in Rome. Though not one of the most exalted houses like those of the Cassii or the Claudii, his father, Publius Licinius Crassus, held administrative office in the Republic. His mother, Aemilia Scora, came from the noble Aemili gens. Marcus was the eldest of 3 children, with one younger brother, who would later become a consul, and one sister, who was married into another influential family to strengthen the Crassus clan. From childhood, Marcus absorbed a spirit of ambition and a drive for success as he watched his parents dedicate themselves to elevating the family's status. Although he never ascended the throne in the monarchical sense, Marcus Licinius Crassus advanced through the ranks of the Roman Republic's cursus honorum at around 30 years of age. He served as quaestor under the consul Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He went on to govern the provinces of Hispania Ulteria and Hispania Cyteria, where he built his reputation by suppressing revolts among the Celtiberian tribes. Over roughly 10 years from his quaestorship to his provincial commands, Marcus proved himself a shrewd administrator and strategist, laying the groundwork for his meteoric political ascent. But his ambitions extended beyond public office. Marcus became famous for massive real estate investments and for purchasing slaves to exploit as cheap labor. Under his control, silver mines in Hispania and Apulia enriched the Crassus household, making him the richest man in Rome. Yet that very fortune painted him as a figure consumed by an unquenchable desire for power after Sulla seized dictatorial authority. Marcus both placated rival factions and used his wealth to sway senators, thereby consolidating his influence in the Senate. By the age of 60, while many nobles indulged in luxurious leisure, Crassus still nursed grand ambitions on the battlefield. Though he had stood alongside Pompey the Great and Julius Caesar in the so-called First Triumvirate, both of whom would become legendary for their conquests in Gaul and the western provinces, he felt overshadowed, merely the third wheel in their glory. That sense of resentment drove him to dream of conquering the Parthian Empire beyond the Euphrates, believing that a resounding victory there would erase doubts about his role as Rome's chief financier. When the Roman Senate refused to grant him a formal declaration of war, Marcus did not waver. He leveraged his political clout to be appointed governor of Syria, the frontier province bordering Parthia. Ignoring warnings from local commanders, experts in Parthian hit-and-run tactics and cavalry warfare, he recklessly assumed Roman discipline and engineering prowess would easily subdue any desert foe. Convinced that Parthia is merely a patchwork of disorganized desert realms, he quickly assembled 7 legions, totaling 40,000 Roman soldiers, along with cavalry and light infantry units, and began planning to cross the Euphrates. Marcus's ambition grew fiercer when he summoned his son, Publius Licinius Cassus, an accomplished warrior who had served under Julius Caesar in Gaul. Publius's presence transformed the campaign from a personal quest for glory into an opportunity to found a military dynasty under the Crassus name. He dreamed that his son would follow in Caesar's and Pompey's footsteps, securing his own place among Rome's ruling triumvirs. Thus, beneath the blazing sun and amidst endless dunes, Marcus Licinius Crassus broke camp at Zeugma and advanced toward the Euphrates banks. At first, desert villages surrendered to Roman siegecraft and orderly formations. The flat terrain seemed ideal for Rome's heavy infantry, and rumours of internal strife within the Parthian court, whispers of princely rivalries, bolstered confidence in an easy victory. Yet from that very first step, Marcus unwittingly entered a deadly gambit, where unchecked greed would carry him toward an unforeseen fate. From the very first steps, Crassus walked straight into the Parthian strategic snare. His opponent was not a disordered horde, but rather a battle-hardened military machine, perfectly adapted to the harsh desert. General Charina, a young and cunning Parthian commander, employed a deliberate bait and lure tactic to draw the Roman legions ever farther from their supply lines, only to exploit the unmatched mobility of his cavalry and horse archers. In the early skirmishes, Parthian detachments would appear on distant dunes, fire a few arrows, and then vanish like mirages to the weary Roman soldiers. These clash looked like retreats, encouraging them to press forward with undue confidence. Every ambush on a supply convoy, executed with silent precision, left fewer barrels of water and sacks of grain for the Romans to claim. Under the relentless sun, the heavily armoured legionaries grew sluggish and dehydrated, while the Parthian horsemen danced around them, striking from every side and disappearing before a counter-signal could be raised. The psychological toll was profound. Nights passed with little rest, as Roman sentries strained to listen for the faintest rustle. Every gust of wind or shifting sand sending shivers through exhausted ranks. Slowly, Crassus came to see that the traditional Roman arsenal, tight formations and elaborate fortifications were of little use on an open plain. His attached cavalry units, numbering perhaps a few thousand, could not match the speed and endurance of Parthian horsemen. His heavy infantry, encased in gleaming lorica segmentata, trudged under the blazing sun, succumbing to sickness, heat stroke, and fatigue. Meanwhile, the Parthians thrived, moving as fluidly as water, their horse archers raining arrows that darkened the sky and disrupted Roman discipline. Every attempt to hunt down a Parthian scouting party ended in frustration. As the Romans advanced in testudo or circle formations, the enemy melted away into the desert mists, leaving only shattered shields and stranded packs. Slowly, but inexorably, supply dwindled. Water barrels cracked under the midday heat, grain sacks spoiled in the canvas wagons. Even salt, used to preserve meat and flavouring dried fruit, became a luxury so rare that speculation drove prices through the roof. The weight of necessity pressed down on the legionaries' spirits. Each march felt longer, each night colder in the thin desert air. The cumulative effect of dwindling rations, sleepless watches, and constant harassment weighed heavily on Crassus's hopes. Yet he clung to one last plan to make a stand at Carrhae, a small town with a reliable spring and defensive ridges that seemed to promise both water and protection. There, he believed, he could force a decisive encounter with Charina, and in that showdown, vindicate every misstep and prove that Roman might was still absolute. As dawn broke on Carrhae's oasis, Crassus ordered his weary legions to entrench a perimeter. The legionaries dug shallow ditches and erected earthworks, propping their standards and shields into crude barricades. Spears and pylons were planted at angles, creating a bristling hedge that looked formidable against any direct assault. On paper, the formation was textbook Roman infantry in the centre, cavalry on the wings, and light auxiliary troops screening the flanks. In practice, it was a desperate gamble. From the eastern horizon, Parthian dust clouds billowed ominously. Charina's host emerged in two distinct echelons. The first, heavy cavalry clad in scale armor, advanced in tight order. The second, horse archers, fanned out like a living storm. Crassus felt a pang of dread as he witnessed the two forces converge. The Parthian cavalry, sometimes called cataphracts, rode on bred for war thoroughbreds, their lances poised for devastating charges. Behind them, the mounted archers built loose arcs, each man ready to unleash a volley of arrows before galloping away. To many Roman eyes, the sight was bewildering. No orderly advance. No drumbeat signal. No herald blowing his horn. Only a seamless wave of metal and muscle that seemed to float compared to the plodding Roman columns. Crassus gripped the hilt of his gladius as memories of earlier victories flickered through his mind. Tales of Germanic hordes broken by discipline. Gallic tribes rooted by cohorts. But here in Parthia, discipline felt like a chain around his own ankles. With eerie calm, Sharina signaled the first strike. A shock of arrows arced over the entrenchments, landing with sickening thuds against shields and helmets. Unlike past foes, who exhausted their quivers quickly, the Parthians drew from hidden carts of fresh shafts, maintaining an unrelenting barrage. Roman shields cracked, javelins splintered, and the legionaries' morale crept ever downward. The heat rose like steam from a boiling cauldron, mixing with the sound of wheezing breaths and creaking armor. When Crassus realized the arrow storm would not abate, he ordered a counterattack. His cavalry, under Publius's command, would charge the cataphracts in the center. Hope flickered in Crassus's chest as Publius spurred his horse forward, trumpet blaring. But the Parthian heavy cavalry was ready. They absorbed the impact with unbreakable ranks of steel and mail, then encircled Publius's wing. Meanwhile, the horse archers wheeled in from behind, cutting off retreat. In moments, Publius and his cohort were engulfed. The clamour of metal on metal, replaced by thundering hoofbeats and the sharp crack of bowstrings. Crassus watched in dismay as his son's force was annihilated. Publius fell, his helmet shattered, and Parthian soldiers paraded his head on a spear as a grim trophy. The sight sent a cold wave through the Roman lines. Legionaries who had once stood shoulder to shoulder now wavered, fear gnawing at their discipline. Crassus' voice, once commanding and clear, faltered as he tried to rally survivors. By midday, the perimeter at Carrhae had collapsed into chaos. The Roman earthworks were dismantled by relentless cavalry charges. The once proud cohorts disintegrated into desperate bands trying to reach the town's gates. Water wagons lay abandoned, slaves scattering to avoid capture. The promise of a decisive victory proved to be a death trap disguised as salvation. And so, under the blazing Parthian sun, and within sight of the oases that once promised deliverance, Marcus Licinius Crassus and Rome's eastern ambitions met a reckoning. Neither could have foreseen. The desert had revealed itself not as a path to glory, but as stage for a masterpiece of attrition, delivered by minds attuned to its brutal rhythm. Crassus's dream of redemption at Carrhae flickered and died, leaving behind only echoes of a gamble that had gone fatally wrong. On the morning of the 9th of June, 53 BCE, the Battle of Carrhae began. Crassus arranged his traditional formation. Heavy infantry anchored the center. Cavalry flanked both wings, and light troops screened the perimeter. Ever attentive to the shifting desert winds, the legionaries stood poised, gladii at their sides, glancing toward the horizon for the signal to advance. Yet before they could move, the sky darkened ominously, as if the desert itself had breathed a sigh of warning. Without ceremony, a relentless rain of arrows descended upon the Roman ranks. Unlike previous foes who exhausted their quivers, the Parthians had organized fresh supply trains of steel-tipped shafts, ensuring their horse archers could fire without pause. Each arrow arced through the bright morning air and struck with a dull thud against Roman shields, which were designed to deflect spears and swords, but proved woefully inadequate against this unending hail. Legionaries strained to raise testudo formations, their shields overlapping like scales. But the weight of leather, metal, and anxiety pressed down upon them, sapping strength with each volley. In the centre, the Romans braced for impact, heels digging into the sand, eyes squinting against both sun and flying metal. On the flanks, cavalry units attempted to counter with swift charges, but found themselves outpaced by Parthian horsemen, who would slip in, loosed a shot, and vanish into the pale heat waves. Light infantry, meant to harass and probe the enemy's lines, instead scattered to find cover behind broken wagons and the skeletal remains of earlier supply carts. The thunder of hooves and the hiss of arrows created a dissonant symphony, lulling exhausted soldiers into a daze, more dangerous than any lullaby. Amid the chaos, Publius, son of Crassus, spurred forward with reckless ardour. He led his cavalry wing in a spirited charge directly at the Parthian centre, believing that a decisive breakthrough might rout their heavy cavalry and restore Roman morale. For a moment, his kinsmen rose in unison, the thunder of their horses' hooves echoing like distant thunder. Yet this was precisely the trap General Sharina had laid. The heavy cataphracts absorbed the impact with impenetrable ranks of scale armour, their horses trained to anchor the line, while lighter horse archers circled behind Publius's men, cutting off any hope of retreat, surrounded on all sides. Publius's force was systematically destroyed, Roman spears shattered against serried ranks, and the crash of metal on metal rang out like macabre bells. Crassus watched from the dunes, helpless, as his son's banner was lowered and then torn to ribbons. Moments later, word spread through the lines that Publius had fallen. His head struck from his body and hoisted aloft on a spear as a grim trophy. The sight of his son's severed head helmet askew, eyes staring blankly, shattered whatever resolve remained in the aged commander's heart. Once a paragon of confidence, Crassus now stood rooted in disbelief. His voice, which had once galvanized legions, faltered into a whisper, carried away by the scorching breeze. The veteran centurions looked to one another, their discipline crumbling like dry clay. Thousands of Roman soldiers, bereft of orders and will, discarded their shields and weapons. Under the cover of retreat, they fled into the shadows of distant ridges, seeking refuge wherever they could find it. Many succumbed to thirst and exhaustion, collapsing in the sand. Others fell to hidden arrow fire as they stumbled blindly through the dunes. By the time dawn's pale light bathed the battlefield, fewer than half of Crassus's original force remained. Their armour was dented, their standards lost or captured, their spirits crushed. Those who still stood clung to each other in ragged groups, faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. Crassus, now a figure of tragic grandeur, attempted to rally the survivors, urging them toward Carrhae as though it were a harbour in a storm. Yet each faltering step he took seemed to weigh him down further, his body mirroring the broken will of his men. The retreat to Carrhae was no orderly withdrawal, but a desperate scramble. Camp followers, slaves, and wounded soldiers clogged the narrow paths, impeding any semblance of formation. Crassus issued commands in a tone both pleading and authoritative, but the words rang hollow in the ears of men whose sleep had been stolen by fear and whose strength had been sapped by constant skirmishes. Every attempt to re-establish defensive works around the town's walls faltered, for the legionaries had neither the energy nor the tools to dig new trenches or raise fresh barricades. Throughout that grim day, the Parthian cavalry maintained harassing attacks, probing for stragglers and raiding the remaining wagons of food and water. Some Romans fought back with valour, repelling small detachments, but each victory cost dearly in blood. By nightfall, Crassus's force had dwindled further, a haggard procession of survivors guided by lamplight and the haunting memory of Publius's fate. The fields around Carrhae were littered with abandoned arms and shattered dreams, a silent testament to the price of ambition unchecked. Crassus himself, once lauded as a paragon of wealth and influence, now appeared gaunt and hollowed, his toga stained with sweat and dust. He gazed out at the ruined legions, hands trembling as he tried to preserve what remained of Roman dignity. Yet in that moment, even he knew the die was cast. The desert had claimed its toll, and the dream of victory had turned to ash beneath the merciless sun. As he ordered the remnants of his army to take what shelter Carrhae's walls could offer, Marcus Licinius Crassus understood that retreat was itself a wound deeper than any sword had inflicted. The day's events would echo through history not as a shining triumph, but as a cautionary tale of a man who dared to chase glory beyond his grasp, only to be undone by the very desert he sought to conquer. After the Romans had regrouped around the town of Carrhae, General Sharina's demeanour shifted with surprising calm. Under fluttering white flags, a Parthian envoy rode forward, bearing an offer of peaceful negotiation. The clear purpose was to preserve the lives of the weary survivors. Crassus, worn thin by days of exhaustion and fearing the collapse of all that remained of his army, welcomed the prospect. He ordered his standard-bearers to hold their lines and instructed a small retinue to accompany him beyond the entrenchments, where he would meet Sharina on neutral ground. Despite urgent warnings from a few vigilant Roman officers who cautioned that the Parthians were masters of cunning and might easily turn on them, Crassus pressed on. He clung to Rome's long-standing code of honour that a general could trust his word under a banner of truce. Beneath the scorching sun, he stepped from behind the battered shields, his toga stained by dust and sweat, and signalled for his companions to follow. With measured strides, Crassus approached the appointed clearing, expecting to discuss terms of safe passage for his starving and wounded legions. What happened next unspooled like a nightmare. No sooner had Crassus and his small party of officers stood within earshot of the Parthian lines than Sharina gave a subtle hand signal. In an instant, the Parthian soldiers, who had formed an ostensibly respectful semicircle, lunged forward. Spears snapped toward the unarmed Romans. Swords were drawn in deadly arcs. Crassus's heart sank as he realized the truce was a ruse. A torrent of betrayal swept over the assembled officers, and within moments they were bound and disarmed, their weapons clattering against the hardened earth. Marcus Licinius Cassus, once the richest man in Rome, found himself a prisoner in the hands of those he had underestimated. In Parthian culture, punishment was as much a spectacle as it was retribution. Symbolic suffering was deemed the highest form of justice. Thus, Sharina had orchestrated his fate with calculated precision. Crassus was forced onto his knees, shackled at the wrists and ankles, while Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers looked on in stunned silence. The air was eerily still, as if the desert itself held its breath. From behind a raised dais, craftsmen unveiled a crucible of molten gold, heated past 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit. That same gold, which Crassus had always prized above all else, hoarded in vaults, used to lavish gifts upon senators, and employed to build his vast estates, would now become an instrument of torturous demise. The crucible was raised on long poles, as Parthian soldiers restrained Crassus's head, tilting it back to expose his open mouth. As the first golden rivulets dripped across Crassus's lips, the assembled witnesses balked at the cruelty. A sizzle rose from his throat as the molten metal seared flesh and bone. Crassus's eyes widened, yet he remained conscious, forced to endure each excruciating moment. The burning metal coursed down his gullet, throbbing with infernal heat, like liquid flame, consuming every soft tissue in its path. Droplets of the precious metal splattered onto the sand, hissing and cooling into jagged shards that glinted in the harsh sunlight. Crassus writhed in agony, his body convulsing as if caught in an unseen furnace. The Parthian nobles watched impassively, their faces set in expressions of stern resolve. Nearby, Roman prisoners were forced to stand guard, compelled to behold the demise of their former commander. Some wept in helpless horror, while others clenched their jaws in silent defiance. The spectacle was both punitive and propagandistic, a clear message to Rome that ambitious incursions into Parthian lands would meet with unspeakable consequences. The agony continued until every drop of molten gold had poured down Crassus's throat. The man who had once commanded respect and awe, who had paraded through the Senate aisles with robes of purple trimmed in gold, now lay broken before the desert winds. Finally, as the last ember of heat extinguished itself within his ravaged body, Crassus inhaled a final shuddering breath, his life extinguished as definitively as a candle snuffed by a gust of wind. In the stunned aftermath, no one moved for a long, heart-rending moment. The Parthians regarded their work as completed, while the Roman captives lay prostrate, unable to comprehend the depths of their defeat. The sun carried on its course across the sky, indifferent to the tragedy it had illuminated. The desert sands, which once promised freedom, now caught the footprints of betrayal. This appalling end of Marcus Licinius Crassus became the stuff of whispered legend among survivors and observers alike. News of the execution spread through the Parthian Empire and beyond. Reaching Rome within weeks, it was carried by envoys who dared not linger, fled like shadows across the desert, recounting the grim details to an audience that trembled at the thought. The message was unmistakable: if you covet our lands, if you trust false oaths and break sacred truces, your fate will be measured not in coins, but in molten metal. Thus, Parthia's calculated cruelty served as a stark deterrent. Crassus's failure and his unbelievably cruel end underscored the limits of Roman ambition and the perils of unchecked greed. In the end, the golden throat that had promised boundless wealth became a monument to human folly, a vivid reminder that a man's greatest treasure can, in the wrong hands, transform into his most dreadful punishment. From the moment tales of Crassus's execution reached Rome, the story spread like a slow-moving desert wind, carrying whispers of dread through the marble halls and crowded forums. It took weeks for the full horror to sink in. As envoys described the molten gold and the final, tortured screams of the richest man in Rome, senators and citizens alike paused in their routines, unsettled by the realization that the eastern frontier, long assumed secure behind legions and fortified camps, was in fact fragile and unpredictable. In the corridors of power, anxiety mounted. The so-called First Triumvirate Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Licinius Crassus had depended upon Crassus's vast wealth to balance the ambitions of his two partners. Without Crassus to fund political alliances, military campaigns, and sprawling patronage networks, the equilibrium collapsed. Suddenly, Pompey and Caesar found themselves without a neutral arbiter, and old resentments resurfaced. The Senate, emboldened by the absence of a tempting purchase from Crassus's coffers, began to play one general against the other, fanning the flames of rivalry. Pompey, accustomed to the Senate's favor, accused Caesar of overreaching Gaul and of gathering too much personal loyalty among his legions. Caesar, for his part, chafed under Pompey's influence and the Senate's obstruction of his proposed veteran settlements. The mutual distrust grew until veiled insults at banquets became open disputes in the forum. All the while, the echo of molten gold loomed as a potent metaphor, just as Crassus's devotion to wealth had ensnared him. The unchecked ambitions of Pompey and Caesar threatened to tear the Republic itself apart. As tension escalated, Rome's leadership realized they needed to re-evaluate expansionist policies. Hitherto, the Republic had relied on relentless military campaigns to absorb neighboring territories. Now, however, the cautionary spectacle of Crassus's fate prompted new voices in the Senate to argue for a blend of diplomacy and strategic restraint. Envoys proposed forging marital ties with local dynasts, offering grain subsidies to client kingdoms, and employing skilled negotiators rather than legions whenever possible. Rome, once convinced that its superior discipline and engineering would secure every frontier, began to acknowledge that understanding local customs and forging alliances could be equally decisive. Yet these reforms moved slowly, hampered by entrenched pride and the still simmering contest between Pompey and Caesar. In many military treatises written in the decades following Carrhae, authors emphasized the importance of mobile cavalry units and the need to train Roman auxiliaries in horseback tactics. Manuals advised against underestimating desert-faring enemies and cautioning commanders to scout thoroughly before advancing into unfamiliar terrain. The phrase "carry both sword and treaty scroll" became a common refrain among officers preparing for campaigns in the East, a testament to Rome's reluctant shift toward a more balanced approach. Archaeological evidence from the site of Carrhae stands as a silent chronicle of the disaster. Fragments of broken pilum shafts, twisted lorica, segmentata, plate sections, and the bleached skeletons of fallen legionaries still surface in the shifting sands. Scattered across the plains are remnants of the wooden chambers once used to store grain and water, now reduced to splintered stumps. Occasionally, shards of Parthian pottery are found, hinting at the presence of the very carts that supplied the endless arrows. These artifacts, housed in various museums across the Near East, remind visitors of the scale of the catastrophe. A full legion's worth of equipment abandoned, a general's dreams and life sacrificed for overweening ambition. In the years that followed, Roman commanders approached eastern expeditions with more circumspection. They reinforced their cavalry wings with recruits trained in foreign tactics and placed greater emphasis on logistics, guarding wells, securing supply lines, and consulting local guides. Envoys were dispatched ahead of armies, bearing gifts and negotiating passage. When confrontations did occur, they were often preceded by lengthy parley and formal declarations, a cautious nod to the memory of Crassus's broken trust. Yet, for all these adjustments, the larger political fallout could not be contained. The rivalry between Pompey and Caesar erupted into open civil war roughly 4 years later, drawing legions home from distant provinces and embroiling the Republic in fratricidal conflict. The very momentary unity once provided by Crassus's resources was replaced by the bitter divisions that would ultimately end the Roman Republic and pave the way for empire. Through it all, the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus endured as a timeless admonition, unchecked ambition, like a molten river of gold, can consume even those who think themselves its masters. The bright metal, coveted for its luster and promise of power, had become a weapon of destruction. In the hush of night, long after the desert winds have settled, the memory of Crassus's fate continues to whisper a warning that in the pursuit of wealth and glory, one must know both the limits of desire and the price of hubris. Under the scorching sun, the Roman legions lay exhausted amidst the bodies of their fallen comrades and the remnants of scattered rations. Each breath carried the scent of sweat, sand, and blood. Attempts to dig new trenches and erect fresh earthworks around Carrhae proved futile. The open terrain offered no natural cover, and the legionaries, weighed down by armor and fatigue, could not labor effectively under such a relentless sky. From the previous night onward, soldiers had cried out in fear at every distant hoofbeat, their eyes bleary with dehydration and sleepless dread. Each errant gust of wind stirred up whirling dust, and each echo of hoof or arrow made discipline unravel like frayed rope. Crassus, struggling to maintain a semblance of command, ordered the fortification of the town's sole water source. He directed small detachments to guard the well and ration its precious supply, hoping to stave off thirst long enough for relief to arrive. Yet local recruitment efforts collapsed before they began. The inhabitants of Carrhae, cowed by the reputation of Parthian cavalry, refused to aid the invaders. Negotiations with desert tribes yielded nothing, as each clan feared reprisal from Serena's forces if they dared shelter Roman deserters. Isolated and bereft of fresh provisions, the Romans found themselves increasingly passive, hemmed in by invisible walls of mistrust and hunger. General Serena, content with his earlier triumphs, chose not to launch a full-scale assault on Carrhae's battered defences. Instead, he maintained a slow but methodical strategy of attrition. Small bands of Parthian horsemen slipped in under cover of midday heat, loosed deadly volleys of arrows at the town's walls, and then melted away into the distance before the legions could muster a coherent reply. These raids, though minor in scale, were psychologically devastating. Each new puncture in the defender's shield drained morale further. The relentless arrow storm continued day after day, and Roman quivers gradually ran dry. When ammunition finally dwindled, legionaries resorted to hurling rocks by hand, a feeble protest against an enemy they could neither catch nor fully see. To make matters worse, the town's only sweet-water well grew contaminated. Animal carcasses, sickened horses, or unfortunate slaves were strewn by the walls, dumping their fluids into the cistern below. Decomposing bodies of men and beasts floated in the once crystal pool, filling the air with a rancid miasma. Even the bravest soldiers hesitated at the sight of that foul brew, their tongues parched beyond endurance, their stomachs turning at the thought of quenching thirst with brackish, polluted water. Desperation finally drove Crassus to plan a daring nocturnal breakout. He summoned officers under the cover of twilight. Outlining a three-pronged escape, one contingent would head northeast toward rumoured springs, another would strike west to intercept a hidden supply caravan, the third would circle south to draw Parthian attention away from the others. In hushed tones, he instructed each group to move silently, no torches, no horns, no campfires. Their only guide would be the stars and the faint tracks of desert wildlife. But the plan, conceived in the haze of hunger and fatigue, was fatally flawed. Under the dim light of a half-moon, the legionaries stumbled into prearranged Parthian obstacles, concealed pits lined with sharpened stakes, and tripwires that triggered a storm of caltrops and wooden spikes. Men cried out as they fell, their legs pinned or shattered. Others lost direction amid the shifting sands, veering off course into small basins, where they became easy targets for lurking cavalry. The clatter of armour and the groans of the injured alerted Parthian scouts, who descended in swift detachments to drive the Romans back toward the town's walls. By dawn, the failed breakout lay in ruins. More than half of Crassus's force was dead, wounded, or scattered beyond hope of rescue. The survivors, many limping or dragging broken shields, made their way back to Carrhae in disordered trickles. Discipline had evaporated. Some soldiers abandoned their standards altogether, fleeing into the emptiness of the desert rather than face another day of siege. Others sat in small clusters, dozing in the shade of tattered tents, their arms lying abandoned in the dust. Crassus, pale and weakened, watched the ragged remnants of his army drift back within Carrhae's gates. Whatever resolve remained flickered out like a dying wick. He realized that the siege could not be sustained. The town's walls offered little real shelter, and no relief force was likely to break through Serena's encircling cavalry. With a heavy heart, he ordered the banners lowered and the gates secured against any further Parthian incursion. The once proud commander, reduced to a haunted silhouette in the morning haze, could only stand by and wait for a miracle that would never arrive. In that grim tableau, Carrhae's final lesson was plain in a war of attrition. Hope can be the cruelest snare of all. The desert, once seen as a path to glory, had become an unyielding prison. Without water, without aid, and without the will to fight on, Marcus Lucinius Crassus and his legions found themselves caught between the bitter past of ambition and the unrelenting present of survival. And as the sun climbed its arc overhead, the silence of Carrhae spoke louder than any clash of steel. The price of overreaching desire can be more deadly than any sword. In the desperate context, the town of Carrhae became an open-air prison for the Romans. The local inhabitants, once neutral or even curious, now turned their backs on the survivors. They whispered to the Parthian horsemen, pointing out hidden wells and the weakest sections of the makeshift walls. These villagers, having borne witness to the devastation wrought by Crassus's ambition, felt no pity. To them, the Romans had come as invaders, trampling their lands and spilling blood in search of gold and glory. Now, they simply sought to survive and saw no reason to side with those who had brought destruction to their doorstep. The Roman soldiers, huddled within the earthen ramparts of Carrhae, clung to the hope of a second round of peace negotiations. Fatigue and fear had hollowed out their ranks. Yet they yearned for the promise of mercy. What terms might be offered? They wondered, would they be allowed to return home, battered but alive? Or would they be handed over to the desert tribes as slaves or worse? No one in the battered legions could say. For the Parthians had offered little beyond the initial ruse. Sharina, perceptive and patient, fully understood the Romans' mental collapse. He saw them as prey, trapped and weakened. With calculated precision, he decided to shift from subtle harassment to a blunt demonstration of power. Once more, a Parthian envoy rode forward under a white flag. But this time the message was starkly different. The envoy bore a vessel pouring with molten gold, heated until it glimmered red in the midday sun. His voice rang out clearly above the muttering crowd. Choose the punishment befitting your greed. There was no pretense of mercy, only the stark invitation to accept the supreme judgment of Parthia. Crassus, already gaunt from sleepless nights and thirst, felt his heart seize at the sight. Any lingering hope of negotiation evaporated in an instant. He hesitated, then stepped forward, bracing himself against the unforgiving glare of the sun. He tried to muster his dignity, tried to recall the dignity of Rome's commanders of old. But each step felt as if he were wading through quicksand. Around him, Roman prisoners, once his own men, were herded into the square, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Despite his pleas for clemency, Crassus was bound tightly to a wooden stake at the heart of Carrhae's plaza. Leather straps cut into his wrists and ankles, securing him in place. Parthian soldiers formed a silent ring around him, their spears upright like sentinels of retribution. Roman captives were forced into cordons beyond the ring, compelled to watch the spectacle of their commander's fate. The oppressive heat climbed toward its zenith, melting wax and sand alike. The wind carried a faint hint of scorching metal even before the crucible appeared. Slowly, Parthian craftsmen lifted a massive crucible filled with molten gold, the metal simmering at temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees Fahrenheit. They positioned it on a tripod above a glowing bed of charcoal. Sharina stood nearby, his eyes cold and unyielding, as though he were observing a ritual of justice rather than an act of cruelty. Crassus lifted his chin in a final gesture of defiance, his lips drawn back in a grimace that might have been mistaken for contempt if not for the tremor in his voice. Then, with deliberate slowness, the crucible was tipped. A cascade of molten gold poured forth, a river of cruel light that hissed as it met the cooling air. The first golden droplet struck Crassus's outstretched lips, searing skin in an instant. His eyes widened, his neck muscles spasmed, and then the flow intensified. The molten metal carved a burning path down his tongue, through his throat, and into his chest. Behind him, the Roman captives flinched, some turning away, others unable to tear their eyes from the horrifying tableau. Crassus writhed on the stake, limbs jerking as if caught in the grip of unseen flames. His mouth opened in a silent scream, though no sound emerged, save for the distant clank of armor. Golden rivulets dripped from his chin, splattering on the dusty ground and cooling into jagged shards. The heat of the metal radiated through the air, raising the temperature around him as if he were the sun's own victim. Parthian nobles watched impassively, their expressions unreadable behind the helmets of state. Minutes stretched into an eternity as the crucible emptied, until the last molten drop slid down Crassus's throat. At that point, his convulsions slowed, his eyes rolled back, and his body went slack. The square fell deathly silent. Then, with a decisive nod from Sharina, the executioner drew a short sword and severed Crassus's head from his shoulders. The head was lifted high on a spear, its eyes glassy in mid-morning light. The onlookers gasped or cried out, some in horror, others in triumph. Roman captives were pushed closer, made to behold the emblem of ultimate defeat. The head, once atop the shoulders of Rome's richest man, became a trophy of Parthian dominion. It was paraded around the plaza, a grim reminder that greed would be met with its own kind of justice. The throne of gold had become a throne of torment, and the desert sands, having claimed their prize, absorbed the final echo of Crassus's ambition. And so, under the unrelenting sky of Carrhae, the Parthians sent an unambiguous message to any who might dare threaten their borders. Those who covet Parthia's lands will find their greatest treasure turned into their greatest torment. News of Crassus's gruesome death travelled the dusty trade routes back to Rome in barely more than a fortnight. First came whispers in the taverns by the Tiber, then notices posted on temple walls, and finally, urgent bulletins delivered by breathless couriers clattering through the city gates. The aristocracy stood aghast. The populace stared in disbelief at the reports of the Roman buried alive in molten gold. Statues of Crassus, once gleaming symbols of his immense wealth and influence, were hastily defaced or chiseled down. His name was scrubbed from public monuments, and senators debated whether to strike his memory from the roll of honor entirely. In the libraries and lecture halls, Carrhae took on an almost mythic resonance. Stoic philosophers used the disaster as a vivid illustration of unchecked hubris in Cicero's lectures. It was cited as the supreme example of how greed destroys even the greatest among men. Tragedians wove the tale into new dramas, portraying Crassus as a cautionary figure whose vault of gold became his coffin. Poets, their hands heavy with ink, lamented how the pursuit of riches had bound Rome's richest man to a stake of agony, an image that haunted readers like a dreadful lullaby in the dead of night. Meanwhile, the political fabric of Rome began to fray. The so-called First Triumvirate Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus had depended on Crassus's treasure chest to balance power among them. With Crassus abruptly removed, Pompey and Caesar stood alone, each armed with legions more loyal to their commanders than the Republic itself. Pompey seized upon the news to campaign for additional forces on the eastern frontier, arguing that Parthia's threat required a substantial Roman presence. He painted vivid pictures of rippling gold, warning that Parthian ambitions extended beyond Carrhae. Caesar, on the other hand, used the vacuum to strengthen his hold over Gaul. He sent dispatches urging swift reinforcement of his veteran legions, suggesting that any weakening of Rome's western defences would invite fresh incursions from across the Alps. His letters brimmed with both concern for the Republic's safety and thinly veiled boasts of his own martial prowess. The seeds of civil war germinated in these rival claims, as each general accused the other of seeking personal glory at the Republic's expense. Carrhae's disaster was not merely a military blunder, but a pivotal event that reshaped Roman history. The delicate system of checks and balances crafted over generations to prevent any one man from seizing too much authority cracked under the weight of Crassus's fall. The Senate, once a forum of collegial debate, now parlayed in factions aligned behind individual commanders. Within 3 years, Julius Caesar would famously cross the Rubicon, igniting a conflict that marked the death knell of the Roman Republic. Historians later pointed to Carrhae as the catalyst, a stark turning point that transformed internecine rivalries into full-blown civil war. In the longer view, Rome's eastern strategy underwent a fundamental transformation. No longer would legions march heedlessly across harsh frontiers, trusting only in their own discipline and the forging of roads. Commanders were instructed to combine military strength with diplomatic finesse. Envoys were sent ahead to broker treaties. Grain doles were offered to client kings, and dynastic marriages were arranged to bind local elites to Rome's fortunes. The narrative of Carrhae was repurposed as a lesson in soft power, the idea that hearts and minds, once won, could safeguard borders more effectively than any fortification. In the lands of the Parthians, the victory at Carrhae was celebrated as a defining moment. Schoolmasters taught the story of the molten gold to each new generation. Emphasizing the ingenuity and resolve of General Sharina, bards sang of the day when Parthian cavalry humbled the might of Rome, turning the legion's treasure into a tool of justice. Carrhae became enshrined in Parthian public memory as a lesson in blood for any would-be invader. Potters molded clay plaques depicting the fateful tableau. Sculptors carved reliefs on palace walls showing Roman helmets melted by the golden torrent. Thus, the echo of that fateful summer day at Carrhae lingered on both sides of the frontier. In Rome, it stood as a slow-burning warning against the intoxicating lure of wealth and ambition, a lullaby of caution sung in dusty scrolls and marble forums. In Parthian, it became the anthem of victory, a story passed from parent to child beneath star-blurred desert skies. And in the quiet moments when the wind rose over the sands where Crassus once marched, one could almost hear the distant murmur of his last, unheeded folly, that the brightest treasure can blaze into the darkest curse when carried too far. In the realm of culture, the death of Marcus Licinius Crassus became a haunting motif for both art and philosophy. Plutarch, the esteemed historian and biographer, devoted a chapter in his work Parallel Lives to the gruesome parable of flowing gold. He described the molten metal as a potent metaphor for the destructive power of unchecked avarice, noting that the very substance which men covet can become the instrument of their ruin. His vivid narrative lingered in the minds of his readers, presenting Carrhae not merely as a military disaster, but as a moral lesson writ large upon the sands of Mesopotamia. In the centuries that followed, Roman poets echoed Plutarch's meditation. They painted Carrhae in elegiac verse, warning that glory built on sand cannot withstand the test of time, and lamenting that to seek honor in the treasury is to court one's own undoing. These lines, often recited in the hush of twilight gatherings, carried a somnolent weight, like a lullaby that soothed with cautionary wisdom. In dimly lit atria, scholars would murmur the phrase, vanity of riches, folly of excess, a solemn refrain that reminded listeners of Crassus's fate. A man who had rolled in wealth now lay entombed in its scalding embrace. At the same time, Parthian artists commemorated the victory at Carrhae in stone and clay. Stelae carved along key roadways depicted General Sharina as a national hero, standing tall astride his steed, while Roman helmets lay shattered at his feet. Bas-reliefs in the royal palaces of Ctesiphon illustrated the molten gold descending like a river of judgment upon Crassus's kneeling figure, the creator's chisel tracing each tortured contour. These monuments became focal points for traditional ceremonies each year. Under the Arsacid dynasty, local priests conducted elaborate rituals at a grand altar to honor the spirits of those who had fallen and to celebrate Parthia's triumph over Roman hubris. Meanwhile, the military establishment in Rome began to rethink its doctrines. Carrhae's lessons inspired a surge of interest in cavalry units, where once Rome had prided itself on the might of its heavy infantry. Commanders now sought to add more horsemen to each legion. Training grounds echoed with the thundering of hooves as recruits learned to maneuver at speed, to fire javelins even as their mounts galloped, and to recognize the signs of desert warfare. Century later, manuals would carry the advice. In lands where the enemy strikes unseen, legions must learn the language of the steed. Equally important was the shift in infantry tactics. The standard testudo formation, while effective in pitched battles, proved brittle under a rain of arrows. Officers introduced drills in which soldiers practiced rapid dispersal and regrouping, simulating guerrilla-style engagements. Shield-bearers drilled with lighter shields, and pilum throwers rehearsed volley techniques designed to suppress enemy skirmishers. The walls of the camps were reconfigured to include angled bastions and covered firing platforms, offering protection against missile assaults while still allowing defenders to respond swiftly. One of the most enduring tributes to Carrhae's impact on military thought appeared in the 4th century treatise De Re Militari by Publius Flavius Vegetius Renatus. He penned, in measured Latin, "If the enemy will not come to the field where our strength lies, we must learn to follow him." This line, simple yet profound, became a guiding axiom for later generals. Garrisons in Africa and the East took note. Scouts were instructed to study local tactics, to map out hidden passes, and to ensure that for every tactic the enemy deployed, the Roman legions carried a countermeasure. Even the architecture of Roman forts evolved. New camps included deeper ditches filled with caltrops, angled parapets to break up arrow fire, and communication posts designed for rapid signaling. Engineers studied Parthian siege techniques, adapting sturdy wooden mantlets and mobile screens that could deploy along the walls in moments. Siege engines were refitted to launch heavier ammunition capable of scattering horse archer formations, and catapults were calibrated to deliver grape shot as well as traditional stones. As these reforms took root, the memory of Carrhae remained a subdued but persistent undercurrent in Roman military culture. Veteran centurions, in the twilight of their careers, would recount the story to young recruits, how the sands of Mesopotamia had turned on a legion's pride, how molten wealth had become lethal rain, and how the spirit of a freeborn Roman soldier was no match for the cunning of the Parthian horseman, unless the legions themselves were willing to learn new ways of war. By the time that the late empire faced fresh incursions from mounted nomads along the Danube and the Euphrates, Rome's composite strategy, melding disciplined infantry with agile cavalry and fortified diplomacy, owed much to the hard-earned lessons of Carrhae. In dusty barracks far from the desert, new commanders recited Vegetius's dictum, almost as a prayer to meet the enemy in his own domain, to speak his martial language, and to ensure that no general would again mistake the lure of golden dreams for the path to victory. Thus, from the silent epics of Plutarch to the musty scrolls of Vegetius, the legacy of Crassus's downfall lingered, a somnolent whisper that warned Rome to temper ambition with prudence, lest it, too, be consumed by the very fire it sought to wield. Beneath the shifting sands of the Mesopotamian plain, the battlefield of Carrhae still breathes its silent testament. Along the banks of the Chabur River, rusted fragments of Roman armor lie half buried in the mud-curved segments of Lorica segmentata, once gleaming silver in the noonday sun, now pitted and dulled by centuries of exposure. Archaeologists have unearthed smashed pilum shafts, the iron tips bent beyond repair, and small piles of Parthian arrowheads, their steel heads uncannily preserved, showing no sign of the decay that afflicts lesser metals. Among these relics, researchers have discovered stone-lined pits containing shards of wooden shafts, stained with traces of fused metal, evidence of the molten gold that ancient writers described in hushed, horrified tones. In one particular trench, a fragment of a spear bears a molten gold band fused around its haft, a silent scar that corroborates Plutarch's account of Crassus's final agony. Nearby, deep impressions in the clay suggest the footprint of a massive crucible, now lost to the winds. Each piece of flaked armor, every broken helmet rim, and each fragment of gold-stained debris transforms Carrhae from a mere footnote in dusty scrolls into one of the Near East's most evocative archaeological sites. Scholars gather under pale tents, their heads bowed in the heat, cataloguing each find with methodical slowness, their pens scratching the surface of notebooks, as though reluctant to disturb the ghosts of that long-ago day. Decades of excavation have turned Carrhae into a living museum, open-air showcases, where guided tours let visitors stand among the relics, imagining the clatter of legionaries' footsteps and the flash of Parthian steel. Students of history, eyes half closed against the glare, trace the lines of broken shields and rusted pilum heads, their minds drifting through centuries as they piece together the final hours of Rome's richest man. Graffiti carved into a stone wall, a modern edition reads simply, "Here, ambition met its end." A sleepy epitaph that resonates with every visitor who pauses to reflect beyond the trenches and the shards. Carrhae's legacy has seeped into the world's cultural memory. In classrooms across continents, textbooks recount the molten gold execution as both sensational anecdote and solemn warning. Teachers, their voices low and measured, to relate how Crassus's lust for conquest brought him to the brink of immortality, only to consign him to a fate more terrible than death by sword or spear. Students squint at illustrated pages showing a general's silhouette bound to a stake as gleaming metal pours down his throat. The scene rendered in faded watercolor tones that evoke the haze of heat and dread. In literature, Western authors have borrowed Carrhae's imagery time and again. In sleepy pastoral poems, the river Chabur becomes a symbol of the inexorable passage of time, carrying echoes of betrayal and hubris downstream. Novelists, their pens heavy with nostalgia, set pivotal scenes against the backdrop of a battlefield, strewn with abandoned standards and overturned chariots. Even in modern thrillers, an offhand reference to the golden tomb of Crassus evokes an aura of ruinous ambition, lending a weighty chill to otherwise mundane plots. The phrase golden execution has entered aphoristic lore, evoked by commentators warning of the perils of excess. Be careful what you chase, goes one common quip, or you might end up in a golden execution. Business schools, in case studies on corporate overreach, occasionally slip in a footnote about Carrhae, reminding young executives that the brightest profits can melt into the sharpest punishments. Financial analysts, voices half lowered when making their presentations, sometimes quote Plutarch's words on the folly of wealth unchecked, as though invoking an ancient guardian spirit to watch over spreadsheets and market forecasts. In the halls of academia, Carrhae lectures draw nodding audiences, clad in tweed and linen. Professors recite passages from Vegetius and Livy, tracing the ripple effects of Crassus's demise through the ebb and flow of Rome's military reforms. The lesson endures that no empire, however mighty, is immune to the consequences of overreaching greed. Seminar rooms, close and warm, fill with the murmur of agreement, as students concede that ambition, like molten gold, can burn the hand that grasps it too tightly. Centuries have passed, yet the message remains surprisingly fresh. While details of the molten gold narrative may have been amplified by poets and dramatists, the core truth endures. Unchecked greed carries a cost beyond mere loss of life or treasure. In a world where the pursuit of material gain often takes precedence over caution and restraint, Carrhae stands as a slow-burning lantern in history, a dim beacon urging us to mind the boundaries of desire. And so, as the desert winds continue to shift the sands over Carrhae's silent graves, the echoes of Roman armor and Parthian arrows still whisper their timeless warning. Even now, when the sun dips low and the air grows slow and languid, one can almost hear the distant murmur of an ancient battlefield and the faint, sorrowful refrain of beware, the golden path. In that sleepy hush, Carrhae's relics remain, etched with the memory of a man who sought to master wealth, only to be mastered by it in return. Following the Carrhae calamity and Crassus's horrific execution, the handful of Roman survivors found themselves scattered across the Parthian frontier, stripped of command and bereft of any clear path home. Many soldiers faced grim choices: remain as prisoners, be sold into bondage, or embrace life in a foreign land. Parthian, shrewd in its response, opted not to slaughter every Roman captive, but to retain a workforce sufficient to bolster its desert borders. Thus, a group of these hardened veterans accustomed to the unbreakable discipline of legionary service were employed as labourers and skilled builders, tasked with reinforcing frontier defences. They dug canals and constructed embankments to harness the flow of the Euphrates River. transforming arid wastelands into manageable terrain for Parthian oversight. At the same time, another contingent of Roman prisoners was quartered in villages lining the Silk Road. There, amid bustling caravans of silk, spices, and precious stones, they learned the Parthian tongue and adapted to local customs. Over years or decades, many of these men married Parthian women and raised families of mixed heritage. Their children, fluent in Greek, Latin, and the dialects of Parthia, embodied the soldier integration policy that Parthian rulers had instinctively understood. Instead of fostering perpetual enmity, they harnessed Roman martial experience and technical prowess to strengthen their own dominion. Word of this unexpected clemency and pragmatic assimilation filtered back to Rome in the form of letters carried by traders and occasional envoys. Reports described how these skilled captives had been granted small plots of land to till, allowed to cultivate olive orchards or grain fields. In Rome, these dispatches ignited heated debates. Observers wondered whether Parthia had outmaneuvered the Republic by converting humiliated foes into productive subjects, while Rome had squandered countless lives and forfeited the latent potential of its own citizens. Prominent historians and orators noted that former legionaries had risen to local leadership positions in Parthian provinces, entrusted with recruiting and training hybrid cavalry units, melding Roman discipline with Parthian horsemanship. This remarkable transformation reframed Carrhae not merely as a military defeat, but as a case study in human resource strategy. Parthia demonstrated that victory on the battlefield was only half the battle. The true art lay in turning adversaries into assets. By contrast, Rome, ever proud of its rigid military structure, was forced to reconsider its treatment of prisoners and subjugated peoples in later campaigns. The lesson was clear: a vanquished enemy, if handled wisely, could become an invaluable ally. The legacy of these Roman expatriates endured for generations. In the decades that followed, August notices appeared in Ctesiphan's grand marketplace, calling for experienced Roman artisans and builders to assist in new hydraulic works. Advertisements praised their skill in constructing durable bridges, aqueducts, and fortified walls. Even a century later, the descendants of these mixed-blood families regarded both Roman and Parthian roots with pride. Their lineage spoke to a blended heritage that defied old hostilities and pointed toward a shared frontier identity. Archaeological digs in former Parthian territories have uncovered remnants of Roman-style cisterns and stonework in structures that, by all rights, should have followed indigenous construction methods. Inscriptions in Greek and Latin appear alongside Parthian script, commemorating the contributions of the Roman builders of the Euphrates. These tangible traces attest to the profound and lasting impact of the soldiers who once marched under Crassus's banner. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the Carrhae prisoners' letters and accounts shaped policy debates for years. Military planners began to argue for more humane prisoner-of-war protocols, noting that respectful treatment might encourage captives to serve as auxiliaries or guide future negotiations. Diplomatic manuals, long dominated by treaties enforced with legions, started to include chapters on post-conflict integration. Senior senators quoted the Parthian example that the greatest strategic dividend could come not from enslavement, but from enlightened incorporation of skilled former foes. In the broader sweep of history, Carrhae's immigrant Romans became symbols of pragmatic reconciliation. Their integration helped Parthia maintain a secure, dynamic border that thrived on both military deterrence and economic cooperation. In turn, some Roman generals who later campaigned in the East would recall, in private letters, the value of forging local alliances and recruiting seasoned veterans from among the conquered, rather than relying solely on the legion's traditional gladius and pilum. Thus, the enduring lesson of Carrhae expanded from the horrors of molten gold execution to the quiet triumph of transformed lives. The failure of Crassus's campaign was not only measured in lost legions and shattered glory, but in Rome's lost opportunity to harness the human capital that lay among the ruins. Parthia's subtle victory lay in converting the defeated into builders, farmers, and defenders turning Carrhae's aftermath into a foundation for cultural fusion and frontier stability. In the stillness that follows sunset over the old battlefields, one can almost hear the echo of Roman hammers striking chisel to stone. The clip-clop of horses, accustomed to new riders, and the soft murmur of mixed heritage voices, speaking both Latin and Parthian. And in that half-dream state, the words of an old proverb linger. The enemy you conquer may yet build your walls. In the sands of the Euphrates frontier, the Romans, once crushed by ambition, became the architects of Parthia's enduring strength, a testament to the transformative power of kinship born from conflict. Nearly 2 millennia have passed. Yet the battlefield of Carrhae still speaks in fragments of rusted metal and crushed bone. Along the southern banks of the Euphrates, and beside the Chabor's slow currents, archaeological teams have unearthed the remains of Rome's shattered might. Crumpled iron helmets lie half-submerged in silt. The once gleaming lorica segmentata, torn into jagged strips by time and conflict. Pilumschafts, their wooden hafts long rotted away, reveal bent and broken iron heads. Testimony to the asperity, charges cut short. Nearby, clusters of Parthian arrowheads lie undisturbed, their steel tips black yet untarnished by centuries, as though awaiting the next volley. Most chilling of all are the fragments of spear hafts bearing traces of fused gold. Tiny rivulets of the precious metal cling to splintered wood. Direct evidence of the fiery punishment that befell Marcus Licinius Crassus. At each shovel's turn, archaeologists pause, shiver at the thought, and record the find with hushed reverence. These shards confirm the ancient accounts that once sounded too dreadful to believe, making Carrhae one of the Near East's most haunting and definitive military excavation sites, beyond scattered weaponry. The dig has revealed more than just slaughtered soldiers. Earthworks long attributed to Parthian engineering bear unmistakable hallmarks of Roman construction. Sections of fortified embankment, now worn to low ridges, were originally built by the captive legionaries themselves. In buried channels, archaeologists have traced the course of irrigation ditches and small dams, all fashioned with Roman precision. Walls of stone and sun-dried brick form the remains of cisterns once used to store sweet water, even 2 millennia later. Portions of these waterworks still hold moisture after rare desert rains, demonstrating the excellence of Roman organizational skill despite their defeat. From a military historical perspective, the events at Carrhae spurred Rome to revise its most influential treatise, De Re Militari. A new chapter emerged, detailing the art of guerrilla warfare and the supremacy of mobile cavalry. It recommended the formation of dedicated light cavalry units known in later centuries as the Ala Secunda Parthica, tasked specifically with countering Eastern cavalry tactics. Corps legions increased training for bowmen, integrating missile volleys into standard maneuver. By the 4th century of our era, military manuals openly cited Carrhae's lesson. Do not regard cavalry and archers as mere auxiliaries, for often they decide the fate of empires. Recent excavations have also pinpointed the precise site of Crassus's execution. Beneath layers of sand, archaeologists discovered a rough platform of desert-hardened mortar, its surface scored with circular grooves. Around this dais lay fragments of Parthian ceramic bowls, likely vessels used to carry cooling water to quench the crucible's heat. The parabolic impressions and scorch marks on the mortar suggest where the gilded crucible once stood, its molten contents poured in full view of a grim audience. Though now skeletal and eroded, the execution platform has allowed experts to reconstruct the chilling public spectacle, a stark demonstration of Parthian power and a lesson in tyranny's limits. Museums in Baghdad and Tehran have collected these relics, carefully conserving battered helmet plates, arrowheads, and pottery shards, stained by blood and water. Exhibits pair each artifact with interpretive panels that recount the ebb and flow of Roman ambition and Parthian resistance. Visitors move from vitrines holding rusted metal to a life-sized reconstruction of Carrhae's central plaza, complete with a replica execution stake and crucible. The muted lighting and hushed narration combine to create an atmosphere both educational and unsettling, a reminder of the cruelty that can arise when conquest goes unchecked. Guided tours follow a slow, deliberate path, echoing the march of the doomed legions. At each stop, docents share accounts from ancient historians. From Plutarch's moralizing to Vegetius's tactical admonitions, school groups glance at the broken pylon and the glint of gold residue, their eyes wide, as they learn that the general who coveted riches above all else became ensnared by the very metal he prized. Scholars, too, linger over maps showing the original troop movements, tracing the expansion of the Parthian ambush that gradually drove the Romans to ruin. In the quieter halls, audio recordings play recitations of Latin and Greek passages describing the battle's aftermath. Listeners, eyes dimmed and bodies relaxed in low benches, hear lines cautioning against hubris. For he who grasps at gold beyond measure may find his throat sealed by the very wealth he sought. The lull of the narration, faint like a lullaby at dusk, leaves visitors in a contemplative haze. They depart with heavy thoughts of how a moment's pride can spawn centuries of lessons. As the afternoon heat wanes and the museum empties, the displays stand silent, their relics gathering dust once more. Yet the echo of that ancient disaster continues to reverberate, a slow-burn lesson about ambition's price and the unexpected resilience of the vanquished. Carrhae's debris iron, gold, and mortar bears testament to the dual nature of conquest and integration, of destruction and construction. It reminds us that history's dust may settle, but its lessons remain vivid, guiding each generation toward a more tempered understanding of power. In the hush of those artifact-laden corridors, one can almost hear the faintest murmur carried over 2,000 years of wind and sand, that the bravest victory may be the one that spares hope from ruin. And the most enduring structure is built not from steel or gold, but from the lessons learned when empires falter. In the long aftermath of Carrhae, Rome's approach to the eastern frontier underwent a profound transformation. No longer would vast legions sweep uncontrolled across distant deserts. Instead, the Senate and people turned towards subtler arts of statecraft. Ambassadors began to shuttle between Rome and the myriad courts of Parthia's vassal kingdoms, bearing gifts of wine, olive oil, and fine textiles. Marriages were arranged between Roman nobles and client princes, weaving personal ties where once only Roman standards had flown. Financial aid, in the form of grain stipends and silver drachmas, was extended to allies anxious to keep peace. Over time, this bread and roses policy replaced the thrust of spear and edge of sword, and the eastern corridor grew more stable, as local rulers found common cause with Rome's prosperity rather than its plunder. By the 1st century of the Common Era, emperors such as Trajan and Hadrian embraced this new paradigm wholeheartedly. Rather than dispatching massive host armies, they authorized the construction of smaller, more numerous forts along the Euphrates. These outposts, spaced at intervals manageable by a few cohorts each, served as both watchtowers and hubs of local trade. At each fort, roads were built to nearby market towns where Roman and Parthian merchants met under the aegis of imperial treaties. This network of enduring lines of defense provided the perfect balance between military readiness and diplomatic engagement. Rome's governors encouraged intermarriage between legionary officers' families and the children of client kings, further deepening regional bonds. Slowly, the frontier ceased to be a hard line of confrontation and became a porous zone of controlled exchange. Within Rome itself, the Carrhae disaster sparked heated debates on the limits of personal power in military command. Senators who had once leaned toward autocratic appointments began to press for reforms. A resolution passed that required any candidate for a major provincial command to secure a clear majority of Senate votes, rather than rely on the simple pleasure or patronage of a triumvir or dictator. This restraint aimed squarely at preventing any single individual, however wealthy or well-connected, from wielding both vast coffers and absolute martial authority. As Crassus had once done, for decades, this law endured, manifesting in more modest provincial mandates and the rotation of commanders in sensitive regions. In practice, it served as a check on runaway ambitions and ensured that generals approached their postings with both accountability and humility. As the Old Republic gave way to the imperial era, emperors built upon these precedents to further refine command procedures. Under the new system, the emperor retained the prerogative to summon or disband legions, but was obliged to consult the Senate and adhere to constitutional formalities. Any major warlike undertaking required submission of a detailed report outlining available legions, auxiliary cohorts, supply stockpiles, and logistical routes. The Senate's War Council, seated in the Curia Julia, would review the proposal, ask questions, and suggest modifications. Only after this measured process could the green standards be raised and the white plumes on helmets addressed to muster the troops. This layered oversight deliberately sought to avoid the Carrhae trap, where ill-considered campaigns had once been launched without full appreciation of local conditions, supply constraints, or strategic risks. By insisting that every large-scale military decision be accompanied by an exhaustive logistics dossier calculating fodder for cavalry mounts, water provisions for dehydrated infantry, and spare shields for attrition, the polity forced its generals to think like administrators first and warriors second. Although such bureaucracy sometimes frustrated eager officers, it undeniably reduced the likelihood of another catastrophe, born of overconfidence and underpreparedness. Meanwhile, training programs for rising officers incorporated case studies of Carrhae as a cautionary tale. Instructors in the imperial military academies emphasized that the alliance of hard power and soft power, forts and embassies, gifts and treaties created a far more resilient frontier than walls alone. Emphasis was placed on language proficiency, cultural sensitivity, and judicious use of local auxiliaries, with the understanding that an enemy's former soldier might become tomorrow's frontier guard. The lessons of traumatic defeat and diplomatic renewal blended into the education of new legionaries and equestrians alike. Over the centuries, these diplomatic and procedural innovations blurred the once rigid lines between conqueror and ally. Rome's Eastern policy matured into a sophisticated tapestry of military deterrence and cooperative influence. Governors were selected not only for their battlefield prowess, but also for their diplomatic skills and logistical acumen. Coins minted in Syria bore bilingual inscriptions celebrating peace and prosperity. Festivals once centered on martial triumphs began to include ceremonies honoring allied kings and local gods, integrating cultural exchange into the very fabric of frontier life. All the while, the shadow of Carrhae lingered in Rome's consciousness as a quiet, somnolent warning. In the dim glow of oil lamps, senators and equites would recall how thirst for gold had led Crassus into an ambush of his own making. They would murmur that true power lay not in overwhelming armies, but in wisely wielding both the sword and the olive branch, and so, beneath the soft hum of late-night discussions, the empire's policy toward Parthia, and indeed toward all its neighbours, remained guided by the slow-burning ember of that long-ago defeat. In that twilight of reflection, Rome had discovered that its greatest strength arose not from unrestrained conquest, but from the delicate balance of force and favour, discipline and diplomacy, ensuring that the mistakes of the past served as the bedrock of a more secure future. And so, as we come to the end of tonight's tale, we see that Carrhae's ancient tragedy still has much to teach us. First and foremost, it reminds us that unchecked ambition, even for the most powerful and wealthy, can blind us to real risks. Marcus Licinius Crassus believed his gold could buy him military glory, only to discover that greed itself became his executioner. In our own time, where success is often measured by wealth or status, that serves as a gentle nudge. True achievement requires more than accumulation. It demands wisdom and restraint. Second, Carrhae illustrates the power of adaptability. Rome's rigid formations and assumptions collapsed under Parthia's swift cavalry, teaching later generals to blend heavy infantry with light horsemen, to honor both force and flexibility. Today, whether in business or personal life, rigid plans can fail when conditions shift unexpectedly. Being willing to rethink strategy, to learn from unexpected defeats, can turn setbacks into opportunities for innovation. Third, the story underscores the value of diplomacy and cultural respect. After the dust settled, Parthia absorbed Roman captives as builders and neighbors, forging bonds that secured their borders for generations. This hearts and minds approach resonates today. Building alliances and understanding local customs often proves more enduring than coercion alone. In an increasingly interconnected world, empathy and cooperation frequently yield dividends that raw power cannot. Finally, Carrhae's legacy invites us to consider how we remember and learn from our own missteps. Archaeologists and historians have preserved fragments of armor and golden shards, not merely to glorify ancient violence, but to illuminate its consequences. In the same spirit, we benefit when we honestly examine our failures, whether in leadership, relationships, or community projects, and extract the lessons they offer. So, what do we take away from this video? That the brightest riches, be they gold, fame, or authority, can burn us if pursued without caution. That flexibility in the face of new challenges can turn an ambush into advantage. That kindness and cultural exchange can build stronger foundations than walls and swords. And that by preserving the memory of our errors, we equip ourselves to live more thoughtfully. Now, as you let these lessons settle, consider how they might echo in your own life. Perhaps there's a Carrhae moment you faced where pride got the better of you, or where a rigid plan met a swifter, smarter opponent. Take a moment to reflect, and remember, wisdom often comes not from victory, but from the quiet understanding born of defeat.